Moderate. Today we're reacting to the non-capitalist solution to the housing crisis. Let's jump right into it.
Olympic Village is your classic Vancouver neighborhood. Seawall? Check. Outdoor athletic store? Check. Big boxy glass buildings? Check. And crazy expensive housing? Oh, you better believe that's a big check. Renting an Olympic Village is not cheap. For example, a two-bedroom apartment in that building behind me will cost you $4,200 a month.
Which means you have to make $8,000 a month. Which means, what? Huh. You're making $100,000 a year? It's not that crazy. Or two people making $50K? That could be done, I guess.
Two-bedroom in this building, $5,000 a month.
That's getting a little bit better.
Bedroom unit in this building rents for $4,500 a month. And just across the street, a two-bedroom unit in that building rents for $1,900. How's that possible? Who's behind this? And could that be the subject of this video?
Who's behind this? Who's behind this? Surely we can use the government to fix this problem. What's the problem, though? Don't live there. Go live in the $1,900 place. Go live in the cheaper place.
So how is this building so affordable? Well, it's really quite simple. It doesn't make money. Let me elaborate. This building is owned by the Athletes Village Housing Co-op, a non-profit cooperative. Like the name suggests, the co-op isn't trying to make a profit from this building, so it sets rents that...
See, that's the problem. Profit seeking. That's the problem.
Cover the building's operating costs. Things like heat, water, electricity, taxes, mortgage payments, and maintenance. The building...
Now, my question is, how do they build another one?
Next door is a condo, and that two-bedroom unit is owned by an individual or corporation who very much wants to make some money from their housing. So they can rent it out for, well, really whatever price they can get. Any money they make on top of their own operating costs is profit they can pocket for themselves. Sorry, I just explained to you how landlords work. Of their own operating costs is profit they can pocket for themselves.
Okay, you got me. If people make profits, they might have higher. There might be some higher costs associated with it. You got me. You got me there. But the question is, should all apartments be nonprofits then? Just seize them all and make them all nonprofits? What if I have a house and I rent out a room out of the house? Do I become a nonprofit now? I'm not trying to be like a facetious or something. I don't really understand how this would work. Anytime you rent out a house, anytime you rent out a room.
Sorry, I just explained to you how landlords work. The condo is an
Landlords are so evil, am I right, guys? God, I hate landlords. Sorry, disclaimer. I used to be a landlord. I used to rent 2 bedrooms out of the house when I owned it back in the day. And it was okay.
The Athletes Village Co-op is an example of non-market housing. The rent is set by just how much it costs to provide the housing. Why does housing like this exist? Well, it's because many people and organizations recognize that housing is, a need. And so they choose to provide housing without trying to make a profit. In some cases,
a need. Yes, we all have certain needs. We have a need. But do you have a right for housing? No.
There are charities such as churches and YMCAs who decide to build housing as part of their larger mission. They're nonprofit organizations specifically for housing who often own multiple properties and rent them out like a regular landlord. There are nonprofit co-ops where a group of people collectively own and manage a building and rent it to themselves. Then there's housing that's provided by the government through agencies like BC Housing. And within these categories, there are all kinds of specializations, such as housing for seniors, single moms, refugees, and, even Korean seniors. Well, I guess I know my retirement plans. Now, is it always affordable housing? Well, that part's a bit more complicated. Cutting out profits can certainly make rents a bit cheaper, but at the end of the day, it still costs a lot of money to build and operate any building. Some non-market housing does receive subsidies to make its rents really affordable, but without those subsidies, non-market housing rents start out pretty comparable to market rents.
What? Wait, whoa. Hold on a second. So your little chart you're flashing back here before, we're at 10309.
It doesn't make money. Let me elaborate. This building is make a profit from this building. This is mortgage payments corporation they can get. I just explained to you how landlords work.
But you bring up this one example. Okay. He brings up these two buildings that are next to each other and they happen to be really crazy in price. But then he tells us later on in the video that this is just an outlier, and that in most cases that even with the profit included. How does that work? These guys make a profit and the prices are still really similar?
Cities, non-market housing rents start out pretty comparable to market rents.
Non-market housing rents start out really comparable to ones that make a profit. That's nuts.
Take, for example, Hannelore Housing. It's a new non-market housing development by the Oak Ridge Lutheran Church. It didn't receive major subsidies, so it charges $2,400 for a 2-bedroom, which is, not exactly cheap. But what can make Hannelore House...
That's not that bad. Actually, that's... that could be within my budget range, actually. Like, that's not that bad, y'all. Where's it located? Location, man. You're like downtown. You're in Olympic Village. That sounds like a really ritzy place.
Housing more affordable is time. Hannelore Housing is in a
drone shot
incoming neighborhood called Oak Ridge. In a decade or so, this will likely be a major city center where art transcends museums, music travels freely, style comes naturally, beauty is all around, and dance is part of life. Wow. Anyways, a regular landlord here would be foolish not to hike up their rents, but Hannelore Housing would keep their rents more or less the same, and over time, that would make its rents relatively affordable. That's why the Athletes Village Co-op seems so affordable now. $1,900 for a 2-bedroom was actually pretty typical for Olympic Village back when it was built in 2010. But today, the co-op is still charging more or less the same amount, while its neighbors have hiked up rents year after year. But there's one more thing that happens with even more time. You see, Athletes Village Co-op and Hannelore Housing took out bank loans to construct their buildings, so much of the rent you pay here goes towards paying off those loans. So what happens when they finish paying their loans? Well, the housing becomes cheap, like really cheap. That's been the case for this co-op from the 1980s, where rents for a 2-bedroom are only $1,000 a month, and the reason why is because it's fully paid off its loans. And that is why many believe non-market housing could be an answer to the housing crisis. Rents all over the province are skyrocketing, and in Vancouver, they're up 23% from last year. Like, people are renting dens and solariums for about $1,000.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
For those who are trying to rent in this market, non-market housing promises a home at a stable price right now and an affordable price in the long term. But hold on. Are we really making housing affordable for everyone here, or just the people who are lucky enough to get into non-market housing? If you look at Athletes Village Co-op and pretty much any other non-market apartment in the city, there are wait lists.
Yep. Of course, people want the cheapest solution.
It's really difficult to get in, and it makes sense. It's cheaper than market housing. So this initially made me feel pretty uneasy about non-market housing. It's great for the people who can get in, but what about everyone else? Could it ever be a solution to the broader housing crisis? Well, it turns out, actually yes.
Why don't you own commercial real estate?
Oh, why don't I own a house?
You own commercial property.
Hey guys, why don't we own?
Let's say you build a lot of non-market housing, like thousands of units, no, tens of thousands of units, no, hundreds of thousands of units, all over the city. You build and build and build until non-market housing is a huge player in the housing market. There are no waitlists, no lineups, no shortages. If you want to live in non-market housing, you can. Well, then you might end up with something like Vienna. In Vienna, 60% of the population lives in non-market housing, regardless of their income, and that has created an interesting effect on the larger housing market. When there is an abundance of non-market housing, private landlords have to compete with non-market housing for the same tenants.
Landlords are already competing with each other for the same tenants.
They can't afford to inflate rents because people will just apply for the non-market housing next door, where rents can be as low as €251 a month. This is known as an integrated or unitary housing market, where non-market housing is so ubiquitous that it actually keeps rents in the private sector from increasing too quickly. In fact, you can measure this effect in places that have lost non-market housing. In Amsterdam, the share of non-market housing has been steadily declining since the 2000s, and with less non-market housing to stabilize the market, rents have rapidly increased.
Show up a graph of population during that time too, please, though, and inflation. These graphs are meaningless.
I think that's the ultimate potential of non-market housing, why it's very much a solution to the broader housing crisis. Because when we build enough of it, it actually stabilizes rents in the overall housing market. But that is definitely not the case here. In Canada, non-market housing makes up just about 5% of the housing in our country, and at those rates,
I'm sorry, that's because most people in Canada probably live on fucking farms and houses and not in the big city.
it has little to no influence on the wider housing market. So how do we change that? How do we build more non-market housing? Well, it helps to understand how non-market housing is built. Let's say you want to build non-market housing. What you first need is land. Some nonprofits like churches already have land, and sometimes the government can offer you public land for free or very cheap. But if those options aren't available, well, that's no reason to worry, because at the end of the day, all you really need to build non-market housing is a positive, can-do attitude and money. You need money. Even if you own your own land, you still need to build something on it, and construction costs aren't cheap. So where does that money come from? Well, like I mentioned, in many cases,
Banks.
it comes from a loan. Athletes Village Co-op and Hanover Housing were able to get loans from Van City Credit Union to construct their buildings. In other cases, the government can actually require housing developers to pay for it. For example, at this location, the local government
Isn't that who's sponsoring this video?
negotiated with the developer to build some non-market housing in exchange for the right to build more density on their land. The result? 233 market condos that subsidize 30 units of non-market housing that's run by a charity called 22-1A. But more often than not, funding for non-market housing is
that's non-market housing.
density on their land. The result? 233 market condos that subsidize 30 units of non-market housing.
This is terrible. Why would you have 240 of them to subsidize 30 of them? They shouldn't have those 30 subsidized. They should just use their profits to lower the price on all these, right? Or no, maybe people might use their excess profits for a good reason.
Housing that's run by a charity called 22-1A. But more often than not, funding for non-market housing is pretty complicated. For example, if you look at the funding summary for this nonprofit apartment in Cole Harbour, you'll see that it took a mix of 4 different grants, selling life leases for some tenants, personal donations, money from foundations, money from fundraising events, and a bank loan. Oh, and they also got the land for $10. If you can't tell already, raising all that money from all those different sources takes a lot of work. And it's really impressive that someone pulled it off. But that is not the process for how you build a lot of non-market housing. So what many have rightfully concluded is that creating more non-market housing will ultimately require more government funding. And the thing is, until very recently, our federal government basically stopped funding this sort of housing. If you look at a graph of new non-market housing units funded by Ottawa over the years, you can see that there is a 2-decade period where almost no new non-market housing was funded at all. Why we stopped investing in non-market housing is a very complex story for another time, but what's clear is that here in Canada, we've kind of a very complex story for another time.
Neoliberalism, segmentation of social housing, de-evolution, private property owning democracy, asset-based welfare, landlord-developer-led campaigns against social housing, fear of social housing failure in the United States.
But what's clear is that here in Canada, we've kind of assumed that the private market can meet our housing needs, that for-profit developers will compete with each other to offer us housing at the best price, without much government assistance. And before we assess non-market housing as a solution, I think it's pretty important that we understand that private market first, and why it's not really working out.
Cut the cable with Verizon Home Internet and cut your internet bill to just $25 a month.
Goddamn internet ads.
Private markets are pretty good at providing consumer goods like computers and t-shirts in the sense that when people want more of these items, the companies just make more. It would be wonderful if housing worked that way, but it almost never does. When there is demand for more housing, creating more of it is a complicated process. There are zoning bylaws in most cities that place heavy restrictions on how much
Man, if only there was. So it sounds like there's the problem with building housing is there's too much government in the way.
built, and any changes to those rules bring out protests from local residents who are concerned about new buildings casting shadows, blocking views, or changing the character of their neighborhood.
Oh, that's terrible. How could they want that?
For example, in Kitsilano, a 5-story development that included non-market housing ended up being so controversial that it took 3 days of public hearings. One resident who opposed the building described it as dropping the ghetto on Kitsilano. All that fuss was over a 5-story building.
Well, who's going to get access to the building, though? It would have been the ghetto. It is going to be the ghetto. The people who are going to get priority access to it are going to be the ghetto.
And it really goes to show, building more housing supply is very difficult. As a result,
Or all like infirmed grandmas.
Vacancy rates across BC hover around 1.5%. And at those rates, landlords can basically name their price. And recently, this has produced a concerning trend. Investors such as pension funds, REITs, and residual income bros have aggressively entered the housing market.
Residual income bros.
And in many cases, these investors don't buy these properties to build new housing, they buy them to take advantage of a low vacancy rate and raise rents. I think the CEO of a real estate investment firm said it best. We think there is a definite shortage of housing in Canada, and the good news for investors is that there is no easy solution in sight. He actually said that. When viewed this way, our
Well, fix it.
housing crisis starts to look more like a feature of the private housing market, not a bug. So, is non-market housing the fix to all this? Well, yes and no.
Yes and no.
Many would argue that what we actually need to do is to fix the rules and barriers that are creating this housing shortage.
That's what I've been saying this whole time. You guys make it so hard to build houses.
And I think that's totally fair. In North America, we make it really difficult to build any housing, period. And even if we decide to build a lot of non-market housing, it will still run into those same barriers. Non-market housing still casts shadows, blocks views, and changes the character of the neighborhood. I think first and foremost, we need to change these rules and make it easier to build housing in general. But on top of that, evidence suggests that it isn't really a good idea to only focus on non-market housing to fix a housing crisis. Because if you only focus on non-market housing, you might end up with Hong Kong. The government here provides 46% of its population with non-market housing, but severely limits development in the private sector. Because of that, private sector rents in Hong Kong are some of the highest in the world.
Huh. That's crazy how that works out.
And people wait 6 years on average to get into non-market housing.
6 years?
Non-market housing is not a silver bullet solution that we can pursue while ignoring the rest of the housing market. It's all interconnected. If there's a shortage of housing in the private market, it will only place more pressures on non-market housing. But with all that being said, I ultimately think that non-market housing is still a critical part of fixing our housing crisis. I think to some extent, building housing supply is always going to have constraints. It isn't necessarily...
So he's just saying mixed economy all the way. We got it, bro. Mixed economy all the way. You know what I'd say? Completely free up everything. Hyper capitalist economy. That's the only way to go forward. And if you asked me, I would get rid of all taxes except for a land tax. Because a tax is disincentivize anything you're taxing. But land can't be created or destroyed. So, good luck with that, you guys. If you guys like this type of commentary content, leave a like down below, subscribe, share for friends. Radically Moderate out of here.